Land ahoy! It was raining. It had rained the day before and the day before that. For millions of years, life swarmed in the seas and rain hammered the land. There was nothing to see except lifeless rock and mud. Then, about 470 million years ago, a little bit of green appeared. The first land plants were growing near the water's edge. These were squidgy liverworts and mosses. They had evolved from green algae, a plant still around today. Like all plants, they used photosynthesis to make the energy they needed. Next came a new type of plant that could grow much taller. They had systems of tubes to carry food and water from the ground to the tops of their bodies, sort of like the way we transport blood around our body in our blood vessels. We call these plants vascular plants. The first vascular plants were just a few centimetres high, with thick stems. We know about them from an accidental discovery made in 1912 by William Mackey, a Scottish doctor, when he was out and about near the village of Rinny. Quite by chance, he spotted some curious-looking fossils in an old stone wall. You see, it turns out that about 4 million years ago, Rinny was a steaming cauldron. There were boiling hot pools of bubbling mud. Every so often, a giant geyser would spout out a huge fountain of scorching water onto nearby plants. And when the water landed on the plants, minerals in it cooled and turned them to stone. When this happens, it's called petrification. And that's where the word petrified comes from. The fossils of Rinny are so well preserved that scientists can see exactly what these ancient plants were made of and how they worked. It is clear that they contained a substance called lignin. Lignin toughens the walls of plant cells. It makes the walls waterproof, so the tubes inside the plant can carry water up to the top of a high tree. It's like having tubing, plastic tubing, instead of tubing made from tissue paper. Lignin makes trees woody and keeps them standing upright. But it took at least 40 million years for these small vascular plants to evolve into proper trees. And they could never have made it to these heights if it were not for another group of living things called fungi. Do you like mushrooms? I have to say they don't score very high on my list of tasty snacks, but researching and writing this book has turned me into a big mushroom fan. And that's because without fungi, the giant group or kingdom of living things to which mushrooms belong, the world would be a disgusting and very smelly place. We don't know much about the origin of fungi. We don't even know if they started life in the sea or land, and that's because their soft bodies don't leave many fossils behind. But we are pretty sure that fungi were already living on land when plants got there. Since then, fungi have developed into a huge variety of life forms, from some of the smallest to the largest living things on Earth. Small fungi are just one cell. The yeast that makes bread rise is one of those. And large fungi are some of the biggest living things on Earth. One fungus in Oregon in the United States is estimated to stretch out underground across nearly 10 square kilometres, equivalent to more than 1,300 football pitches. Fungi feed on other organisms just as animals do. Most fungi are made up of an underground network of root-like threads called a mycelium. The mushroom is just the part of the fungus that pops up above ground. The mushroom's job is to spread spores. These tiny reproductive cells get blown by the wind, then settle themselves and grow new fungi identical to their single parent. Fungi are vital for all life on Earth because they eat dead things. Without them, the world would be drowning under piles of the dead bodies of plants and animals. Not a happy thought. And they also make chemicals that help plants grow. Sometimes nature has a real fondness for teamwork. Big networks of underground fungi pass nutrients and water to the roots of trees, and in return, trees supply fungi with food. Thanks to ancient fungi, primitive plant life was able to move further inland, enriching the soil as it went. Soil is made up of sand, minerals, and the decayed remains of once living things. Plants, tiny animals, including worms, and fungi all help keep this precious life force working. They turn fallen leaves and rotten trees into nutrients to help new plants grow, and they have been digging up the soil for the last 400 million years. All that digging mixes the soil, renewing and regenerating it. This is called the soil cycle. In fact, without living things, there would be no soil, and the earth would be nothing more than dust and rock, like the surface of the moon, Mars, or Venus. Fungi and plants were not the only organisms to move onto land. A few crawly creatures emerged about 440 to 420 million years ago. And the first ever land animals were probably arthropods. This group includes millipedes, insects, spiders, crabs, lobsters, and a whole lot of other creatures with jointed legs and hard outer parts called an exoskeleton. It took about 50 million years before another kind of animal made the move onto land. If you were a fish living in the seas back then, life could be over fairly quickly. Stinging jellyfish, sea scorpions with deadly tail spikes, and giant placoderms were just a few of the dangers swimming around. If you were able to get out of the water, you might have had a better chance of surviving. After all, the shores were now full of plants and juicy worms to eat. Fish aren't built to live on land, though. One problem is breathing oxygen from air instead of water. Another is working out how to move around. Imagine walking on fins instead of legs. It wouldn't be as simple as a walk in the park. Tiktaalik found a way around this. It used its fins to wade through shallow bogs and heave its body out of the water onto land, which means Tiktaalik is the first creature ever known to have been able to do a press-up. Tiktaalik lived about 375 million years ago, when primitive plants were growing near the shores. Its fossils show how fish-like fins were now being used as the first real arms, shoulders, elbows and wrists. It's bizarre to think that the reason you and I have wrists and ankles goes all the way back to creatures like Tiktaalik. That's because they needed hinged joints to heave their bodies up off the ground. Do a press up for yourself and you'll see just how important these hinges are. Tiktaalik is one of the first of a group of animals known as amphibians. Amphi in ancient Greek means both, and bios means life. They live both in the water and on the land. Not only could the first amphibians walk on land, but they could also breathe through primitive lungs rather than using gills like fish. Equipped with these new features, some amphibians, such as the 2-metre-long Europos, became the most dominant creature on the land. They had staying power. Their descendants include modern frogs, newts, and toads. While amphibians were growing into giants, so were plants. As we saw earlier, some plants had developed woody stems to stay upright, and thanks to fungi, they could gather food in their roots even if they weren't living near the water's edge. But to move the water and food up their tubes against the pull of gravity so that they could grow tall, they needed a pumping system. A plant's key to growing tall lies in millions of tiny holes that cover the surface of its leaves. Depending on the weather, plants open or close these little holes, which are called stomata. When it's hot, water in the leaves evaporates through the stomata making the sap in the stem more concentrated, and this causes water to be drawn up into the leaves at the top. It's a process known as transpiration. Early land plants, including trees, created spores just the way fungi do. They released the spores into the air and let the wind spread them. But spores need warm and wet conditions to grow. And that's fine in damp marshes or bogs, but hopeless in dry areas. By about 360 million years ago, some plants had developed a new way to reproduce: seeds. Seeds are stronger than spores. They have a hard, water-resistant coating called a testa. The protective coat keeps seeds from getting damaged in the air, on the water, or even inside an animal's gut. Inside the coating there is an embryo, the part of the seed that will grow into a new plant. And with its own private stash of food in the form of sugars, proteins and fats, the seed has plenty of nutrients to grow, even in a tough environment. One of the early seed-bearing trees was the cycads. They look like small palms, although they're not related, and can be traced back to about 320 million years ago. About 300 species of cycads are still living today. Like eyesight and trilobites, seeds changed the world entirely. For millions of years, they have made plants the dominant form of life on land. Can you imagine a millipede the size of a person? Or a sea scorpion that is bigger than your outstretched arms? If, like me, you are not sure that this is a world for you, then be grateful you were not alive 300 million years ago. Welcome to the Carboniferous period. How insects learn to fly is still a mystery. Experts think it probably had something to do with the arrival of tall plants and trees. Wouldn't it make sense for an insect to develop little wing flaps to jump or glide from one tree to another? That way, they wouldn't have to climb all the way down and then up again. Gradually, the wing flaps would have grown larger. Finally, insects could glide, dive, and flap their wings. Seagull-sized relatives of today's dragonflies were some of the most spectacular insects that have ever lived. Griffin flies had complete command of the skies. They could feed off smaller creatures as and when they liked, and there were no birds back then to challenge them. They might even have had nearly all-round vision, the way their relatives do today. No one knows exactly why these creatures could grow so large. Some scientists think high levels of oxygen in the air, almost twice as much as now, allowed animals to get bigger. Others have shown that too much oxygen can be poisonous to tiny baby creatures. They think Carboniferous babies had to grow bigger fast so as not to be killed by the high levels of oxygen. But a giant insect fossil has been found for a period with much less oxygen, and that makes some experts wonder if oxygen was the cause at all. That's the way it is with science. Ideas that explain the evidence we have are called hypotheses. When we get new evidence, we sometimes have to come up with a new hypothesis. In a world of fierce giants, other creatures simply had to adapt or die. And adapt they did. Smaller creatures evolved folding wings, just like those we see in houseflies today. This new kind of wing meant that small insects could crawl into narrow spaces. Larger, fixed-winged griffin flies and other predators couldn't reach them in there. Flying insects with folding wings are by far the largest group of insects alive today. It goes to show that the folding wing probably counts as another of nature's most successful adaptations ever. Just about this time, when griffin flies ruled the skies, the world's land masses had started colliding together into one giant continent. It is called Pangaea, meaning all earth. And while this was happening, the climate became warmer and drier, so the ponds and puddles where amphibians laid their eggs probably started to dry up and disappear. More animals had to compete for less water. As usual, when the environment changes a lot, animals changed with it. Amphibian eggs are squishy, with a covering that lets water in and out. And that's the best way when you lay your eggs in the wet. But as the land dried out, some creatures began to lay a new kind of egg. One a little like a plant seed, with all the water and nutrients a baby creature needs contained inside a leathery, soft or hard shell. Armed with these new eggs with waterproof shells, these animals could press up their way inland as far as they liked. Then they could lay their egg right on dry land, and after a few weeks, hey presto, out hatched a little creature. We call this group of animals reptiles. So a waterproof egg is actually a portable pond or puddle. These little marvels of nature change the story of animals by allowing them to give birth away from water. You may find eggs also make for some quite interesting breakfast talk. The earliest known reptile is called Hylominus. Yeah. This 20 centimetre long lizard-like creature lived from about 312 million years ago in the Carboniferous period. It ate millipedes and insects. It was food for large amphibians and giant griffin flies. Fast forward a million years and reptiles ruled the land. One very cool example is Dimetrodon. Growing more than 3 meters long, this lumbering giant walked on 4 legs and had a long swaggering tail. Dimetrodon was the largest meat eater of its time. It had a peculiar sail on its back, and some scientists think it may have been used to heat up its body and blood in the early morning sunlight. It could then have helped to release heat and cool the Dimetrodon in the warmth of the day. Creatures like Dimetrodon roamed the land for about 60 million years, but their time came to a sudden end when life suffered its worst ever brush with death, the Permian mass extinction. That single supercontinent, Pangaea, was now fully formed. When continents collide, one thing is certain: you can expect more and bigger volcanoes to erupt. What's the biggest volcano you can imagine? How about one that spreads lava over an area the size of Western Europe and then goes on erupting for another 1 million years? That's what experts think happened 252 million years ago, forming the Siberian Traps, a huge area of volcanic rock in what is now northern Russia. But that is not all. Volcanoes throw out lots of carbon dioxide into the air. Carbon dioxide is one of the gases responsible for global warming. Experts think that at the end of the Permian period, the Earth's climate had become too hot for most life forms to survive. 9 out of 10 species and plants and animals went extinct. It was as if life on Earth had been struck down by a killer fever. But this was no ordinary illness because it lasted 80,000 years. Very few reptiles survived the terrible Permian mass extinction, but one of these survivors is very important to us. Lystrosaurus is a link between reptiles and mammals. If it hadn't survived, some experts think mammals may never have evolved at all. Humans are mammals, so we must be thankful that this possible distant ancestor of ours made it. even if it did look like a cross between a lizard and a pig. Then, out of disaster came a completely new generation of reptiles. These were the most fearsome creatures ever to tread the earth. Welcome to the age of the dinosaurs.